With the election years and the GOP, debates, one of them was last night, and I think Islam and Muslims become a huge issue, especially with the Democrats and the GOP debate, banning Muslims, banning Sharia law. This is not something new. Now, with the introduction of the bill, started in North Carolina, of banning judges of using or considering foreign laws in their decisions. So it's not just a political issue. I have here Professor Ahmed Atif Ahmed. He's a professor of religious studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, graduate of Harvard University. And as he said in his website, he's been in love with law and legal epistology for a long time, even before he studied. So welcome to our show, Ahmed. And this is not just a political issue anymore. I mean, I understand people can be Islamophobic and about things, but this is actually a bill. This is actually a legal argument that's taken place in our Congress and beside the campaign trail. So, tell us a little bit about when we say Sharia, what are we talking about?
Well, the word, of course, means different things in different contexts. If you are in the Muslim world, you could mean by it the customs and traditions and habits, what you might call, if you look for a fancy word, the social muscle memories of a community and an individual who's part of the Muslim community. And sometimes that person might not even be a Muslim, but just somebody who lived with Muslims too long. And that would mean not law in the modern sense. So, for example, in that sense, the Sharia might make you, your Sharia habits might make you refrain from a contract that involves manipulation, even if it is not illegal. So, in that sense, it's a personal law. The second meaning is when the Sharia is a national law, part of the national law. Of course, there have been many academic arguments that the Sharia can never be part of a modern national law. But modern governments in the Middle East think that they established some of their laws, at least, based on medieval legal reasoning. So, for example, the laws in Saudi Arabia derive directly sometimes from arguments that are 700 years old or something. That's true also in Egypt, by the way. So it's not only countries that tend to be traditional in their outlook. Because before modern laws, there were laws. So this is something people have to understand. The idea that the modern European version of laws was the first time people understood that there was a law. There were other laws, and they had their social aspect too. So people accustomed themselves to certain habits based on the laws that were going around. So in that second sense, there is Sharia in national law. In Egypt, for example, you'd find protections of the weak party in certain contractual agreements, so which are very much against the capitalist spirit. So the weak party may have entered supposedly voluntarily into a contract, but then the law says that that person was under duress or was taken advantage of, and so on. That derives from very old religious laws. So the third meaning is a law that's a little bit obscure. The third meaning is when the Sharia is a restriction on the government, where there are laws that, and there is less and less of that now. But for example, at certain points in modern history, there were areas where people sold their property based on private agreements between the seller and the buyer, and these sales were not documented properly. And the government would want to say that that sale didn't exist because it's not documented, but people would argue that this is accepted in their old practice. So these are essentially laws that go against national laws sometimes, and they come from old social and religious laws that come from before and have become part of the modern world too. I mean, it's not something that doesn't happen anymore, but it happens less and less in my sense. Now, there is a fourth sense of Sharia that we're talking about when we talk about Sharia in the United States, which is maybe a modification of the first sense, where Sharia are personal laws. Individuals want to bind themselves to do certain things. For example, a man might dedicate a certain amount of a gift, essentially, they call it dowry, to his wife. That might not even be enforceable based on American laws because the sum might be too large. So somebody says that upon the divorce, or if this marriage were to end at all, this gift that was supposed to be the dowry is a little complicated because part of it can be at the beginning of the marriage and part of it at the end, but it's definitely due by the end of the marriage. So somebody might owe $1 million or a couple $1 million at the end of the marriage, and take that seriously. Now, the bills you mentioned, I think it varies state by state, but there are a few general principles because they come either from the Constitution or from federal law. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act 1964 stipulates that you can't discriminate against people based on religion. And that doesn't just operate, as you mentioned, in that you cannot say we will not apply foreign law if it comes from Islamic law. You have to generalize that a little bit. But you also can't really prevent people from applying certain religious laws.
Mhm.
It won't matter what this bill says because there is a federal law that prohibits discrimination based on religion, and that affords Muslims some protection. It's a lame kind of protection, though, to be clear. So we don't want to make it sound that Muslims will get their way, but the courts will always look at the situation and see whether it's reasonable or unreasonable for people to have the expectation to practice
When you
freedom.
say reasonable or reasonable, how is that related to the Constitution?
Exactly, right. So, I mean, the standard that the judges are looking at is whether the person sincerely holds a certain religious belief.
Hmm.
Now, it's an obscure point and a complicated point because really what happens most of the time is not that we're discussing the belief, we're discussing the practice.
I see.
So if a worker is trying to do their prayer, we ask whether they sincerely believe that they have to do the prayer. But what's at stake is the
Yeah.
prayer, is the
Well,
action.
and most, my understanding in most of the Sharia is really talking a lot about beliefs, and that's usually between the Muslim and God, the relationship with God, and nobody can, kind of infringe on that or understand it or even kind of figure it out. If you wanna pray or if you wanna fast, or if you wanna, don't eat pork, whatever. This is all. But I think the components of the practice is probably what will be the concern here, not the beliefs. I mean,
Produced or reproduced anymore. But you see, so your point actually is interesting. Fear usually goes with ignorance, though. There's nothing new there.
yeah.
People are afraid of that which they don't know. And John Esposito, the Georgetown scholar, was here at UCS a couple of weeks ago and said that there have been studies that show that Islamophobia is on the rise, usually on election years. So this has been looked at 2004, 2008. So this is just about the time of the cycle, that you will hear attacks and
Sure, I see.
people will say bad things, and it will subside at some point when people kind of get done, get the energy out.
So, what is the source of Sharia in general?
That's a good question. So I've always wanted my students to understand that historically the Sharia is also a human law in a very important sense. The founders of the schools and the people who the law schools, so not law schools in the physical sense, but what we call in Arabic the madhabs, the schools of law, the ways of reasoning. The founders of these schools and their followers and the later authorities of Islamic laws, then any Quranic verse, the Quran and the Sunnah, these revelatory sources, are there, of course, and nobody can go against them in an obvious sense, although most of the law really modifies the general instructions of the Quran. For example, I mean, the Quran can say, you cut the hands of the thieves. But there's nothing like that in Islamic law. There are specific requirements for what you call theft. There's nothing general like that. So, for example, uh, if you steal money by force, that's not theft. You don't cut the hands of somebody who steals money by force. If you have to basically take the money from a place that is considered a secure deposit for that property. If somebody steals, say, my television from my home, that would be the theft that the jurists are willing to entertain the possibility of corporal punishment for the thief. At the same time, there has to be a certain value of the object that they stole. All this is not in the Quran. All
And
this is not in the Quran. So Islamic law is a much more relaxed and much more of a juristic law, a people's law, but not every people. I mean, it's not a
yeah,
democratic law.
yeah.
It's based on an art that's developed by a certain kind of legal aristocracy that over time it developed its own language and art to
And
use them.
interpretation.
Right. It's all interpretation in that broad sense of interpretation. Yeah.
So it can be different from state to state, Pakistan and Egypt, or usually they are,
Historically, city to city,
yeah.
you could end
I
up
see.
with
Judge
right.
to judge.
States are a modern phenomenon. I mean, states
Yeah.
now, of course, have their own federal laws. But one thing about Pakistan, since you mentioned Pakistan, Pakistan has 5 jurisdictions, and each one has its own federal Sharia court. So Islamabad, the capital, and 4 other provinces. And occasionally there are a few differences that that the judges arrive at but there are a few things also that apply all over Pakistan. They're non-negotiable. Just like you have here, the federal system has a few laws where you can't negotiate the matter. Like, for example, the marriage issue. Recently, the Supreme Court in this country decided that however many states, I think it was 16 states left, that said that we will not consider a man and a man's union to be marriage. And they were told, no, you can't. You don't have that freedom. It's a constitutional right. So there are a few things where the law is the same everywhere in the U.S. It's also true that the law is the same everywhere in Pakistan, but there are a few matters where it differs. And historically, it differed a lot, of course.
You know, when you were mentioned about the people who are qualified to talk about Sharia or interpret Sharia, you were cut off. But can you revisit that? Who is qualified to interpret the Sharia or apply it?
So the way jurists were manufactured, you could say, in the past was an initiative. It was a private initiative by people who lived in different Muslim towns. In Sunni law, in Sunni Islamic law, the founders in the beginning, one of them lived in Iraq, one of them lived in Medina, which is in Western Arabia. And they thought differently about how to make laws. So, for example, the man who lived in Western Arabia thought that the custom and tradition of the companions of the Prophet and their children should be the foundation of the law. So whatever they did when they prayed or when they entered into contracts in the market, when they got into marriage contracts or when they applied criminal law, that would be the law. And the other scholar in Iraq thought, no, you have to have a few rational principles, general principles, and kept thinking about what these principles are. And sometimes the rational principles didn't work all the way, so he had to think of exceptions. So he reasoned mostly from analogies and disanalogies as opposed to the tradition itself. And then there was a third school that tried to reconcile the two, but went more in the textual direction. And then the fourth school, in the Shia tradition, they believed that the knowledge of the law was essentially something of a family business. The Prophet taught his cousin, and then the cousin taught his children, and this family has a particular understanding of what the law is and how it evolves,
Mm-hmm.
what it is really, and then they kept thinking about new circumstances and new situations based on these principles. It has its own schools. So there is the Jafari school, which is dominant in Iraq, has a high emphasis on rationality, and they think always about the nature of the act that a human being is doing, and they try to find standards by which to say whether this act is good in itself or bad in itself.
Mm.
And they judge it accordingly. And they have, I mean, it will be always reductive to try to explain how different systems work, but they're just so diverse.
So they have precedents they look at, or they can actually rationally come up with a new interpretation, like the
Precedent,
laws here.
right? Precedent doesn't work. Actually, it doesn't work anywhere except
Yeah,
in the common law.
I see.
It doesn't work in the
I
civil
see.
law tradition. It doesn't work in European laws, and it doesn't work in Islamic law, and it doesn't work in most laws. In Islamic law, if you come close to the question of precedent, uh, jurists would say that no two cases are alike.
I see.
It's never the case that a new question is the same as the old. Now, that doesn't mean that they can be similar. They're similar.
I
So you
see.
want to ask why they're similar, you go back to a principle. So if there is any respect for something like precedent, it comes from analogical reasoning or principle. But it gets to be different because precedent, what precedent tries to do is create conformity by saying that if we judge a similar case a certain way, we have to judge similar cases similarly. But I mean, that goes back. By the way, precedent is a very interesting doctrine. It goes back to the 12th century,
Yeah.
and what it was really was that at that time, London had transportation wasn't that easy in England, and the idea of local judges judging just based on their own whims was disturbing. They wanted to figure out a way to force these people to follow the judgments that were already given in English courts in the past. So I mean, it's a very well-meaning thing, but it can be a problem too.
This is interesting because the idea of laws is to standardize, human behavior in a certain way. I'm not saying exactly everybody should take the train station in the south and north, cold, hot, whatever. But isn't it the idea of the law that we have a standard measurement or framework where people can behave or can, whatever the case may be?
That's taken for granted. Every law does that, right? But
Yeah.
they think about conformity and standardization differently.
I see. I'm really, of course, I'm not a scholar in anywhere or any subject or legal, but I'm looking at it from a political and go back to political and cultural thing, and it terrified Americans when they hear Islamic law or Sharia or whatever. People have known nothing about it. They never got excited about anything, about the Constitution or slavery or inequality or any other major issue that actually American is facing. But when you hear Sharia, I mean, everybody is up to sign and all of that. But when we look at some of the Muslim countries, they have actually kind of combined Islamic law with European laws. And there's no problem there. I mean, I don't see a lot of Muslims say, well, need to get rid of the French law that is part of the Egyptian constitution or whatever. So what is the attitude in the Muslim world themselves toward common law or civil law or European law or whatever the case may be? The historical development of Sharia in the last, let's say, 100 years, when really the Islamic world, the Middle East becomes of interest of the Western world, and people come there. Is there a debate within the jurisprudence themselves about how the Sharia law, the challenges that Sharia is facing with modern life and modern laws, and must be another way of looking?
Okay, so as I said to you, it's a problem. It's been a problem for Muslim jurists of the past. It makes very little economic sense to punish thieves by cutting their hands. And not just this one. Most corporal punishment was applied rarely because there's a very high cost to it.
And there's a lot of conditions too, but still,
Exactly, right. So they add these conditions. These conditions don't exist in the revelation. The jurists wanted to narrow down the area. But don't get me wrong, of course, there were corporal punishments in medieval Islam, and partly also the sensibilities changed on this. In the past, people used to like to watch these things. And actually, in this country, until the 19th century,
yeah, exactly. We have Saudi
sometimes the killing of
Arabia.
people was one of the most interesting spectacles for people. People forgot that. But people have now thought differently about it. Although, most recently, honestly, with the phone cameras that capture all the gruesome
Yeah.
images, people are getting reaccustomed again to
Oh, I see.
gruesomeness as being part of the.
It's a
But at
spec.
least there was a time when the sensibilities were such that we didn't want to watch these things. We didn't want to hear about them. In fact, the prison system is the excellent solution to this situation because whatever happens in the prisons, people don't know about. But a lot of gruesome things happen in the prisons.
But
So,
punishment, the idea of punishment is deterrent. It's a deterrence. So the public has to be, that's a problem. People will be in jail for 30 years because they kill somebody and they die, whatever. Nobody sees the relationship between the act and the punishment is not here because nobody sees it. So people will, the violence and the violation is still,
well, I mean, okay. So, no, I think modern laws provide deterrence because people at least hear the stories about people who just disappeared and went away. But the deterrence works differently. It depends on the psychology of the population. So in the past, it used to be important for people to see,
I see.
that punishment, and they begin to wonder whether they would accept being in that situation or imagine that before they try to before they think about committing a crime. Well, yeah. Anyway, I mean, there's so many points there, but the corporal punishment is a very interesting thing. I don't think it died out. I think it exists, but behind the scenes. And the people who are afraid of it should look at prison studies to see what they're really, they're sure that their tax money doesn't support corporal punishment in different places. I mean, my point, of course, is not a polemical point, but I'm just saying that it's impossible to imagine a criminal system that's kind to the criminal.
Yeah.
Actually, Justice Kennedy, in one that's Anthony Kennedy, who's on the Supreme Court, he had a speech back in 2003 in front of the American Bar Association and said something about how the criminal justice system directly attempts to demean the criminal, and that's not an acceptable purpose for a democratic society. Now, that's his moral reasoning. He's a good guy, but I'm not sure that people are particularly disturbed by that. Maybe people think that you should demean the criminal. I mean, it's a big question because the criminal is also a criminal. The criminal has to be punished, but how can you strike a balance between protecting everybody, but at the same time not necessarily dehumanizing any individual?
The criminal lose some rights as an individual.
They have to, right? They have to lose some rights, but the question is, how far do you go?
It doesn't mean you demean him as a human. I mean, you can use freedom, you can use freedom of movement, but this is, this is not going to go away. With really appreciate your input in this conversation, and thank you so much, Professor Ahmed, Professor of Religious Study at University of California, Santa Barbara, and he's sitting there in a nice weather and enjoying the weather, and we'll let you enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll talk to you, I'm sure, soon.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just